Boldwood presents A Leap of Faith for the Cornish Midwife, written by Joe Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Izzy's grandfather had never been good at keeping secrets. He'd been the one to blab to her when she was 7 that she was getting a purple bike for her birthday. Pops hadn't meant to give the secret away, but when he'd taken her to the supermarket with him, he'd picked up some metallic streamers in the toy aisle and said they'd go perfectly with her new bike. He clapped his hand straight over his mouth, but it had already been too late. So she'd always been able to rely upon him to make sure that nothing much surprised her, good or bad. Except now her grandparents were driving her towards Port Agnes, and neither of them were giving a hint away about why. Her grandmother had even threatened to send Pop's Cornish Pirates rugby shirt to the charity shop if he let the secret go this time. He'd worn the top religiously to every match he'd been to and was convinced it was a lucky charm. Izzy had bought him a new one 3 Christmases before, but he'd only ever worn that one around the house. The threat of his supposedly miraculous shirt finding its way onto a rack in the Oxfam shop seemed to be working a magic all of its own, seeing as this time he was keeping his lips firmly sealed. "Can you at least tell me if we're going to Port Agnes, or just in that direction?" Izzy would have known the route from Redruth to the seaside village where she worked even with her eyes closed. Over the past year, working in the midwifery unit, she'd made the journey so many times that every twist and turn in the road felt familiar. The plan had originally been to give up her rented flat in Redruth and move to Port Agnes. But then her grandmother's health had taken a turn for the worse. She'd been diagnosed with an inoperable tumour that had seemed to spread overnight, and it had looked like it might be the end. There'd been so little Nonna had the energy to do that it had broken Izzy's heart just to leave her to go to work. But then her doctors had put her on some new medication that was part of a trial, and it appeared to be even more magical than her grandfather's rugby shirt. They'd warned them not to believe that it had really worked a miracle, but it had bought them some more time together, and even more importantly, it had given Nonna her quality of life back. Not long afterwards, her grandparents had announced they'd been saving for a house deposit for Izzy, and that they'd found a cottage in Port Agnes that looked perfect. The sale had all seemed to be going according to plan, but then the couple selling the cottage had changed their minds just before the contracts were due to be exchanged. It meant relocating to Port Agnes was on hold, but deep down, Izzy was glad. She wanted to make the most of every minute with Nonna, and anything else could wait. "Why are you so desperate to know what's going on?" Her grandmother's tone was teasing. "Just enjoy the view. Such a beautiful day today." "It really is, Baby Belle, and you should make the most of it." Pops finally risked opening his mouth to back her grandmother up, using the nickname he'd had for her from when she was tiny. They were right, though, and there was nowhere else she'd rather be than with the 2 people who meant the world to her. "Okay, but I want to know if you thought of any more ideas for your summer fun list, Nonna." Izzy ran a hand through her dark hair as she spoke. When her grandmother had first received her diagnosis, she'd made a very modest bucket list. But after the new medication had given her so much more energy, Izzy was determined to help her make the most of it. "It depends what you think of the surprise we've got planned." Nonna turned to look at her and dropped the perfect wink. "Because it could be the start of a whole list of things we could do." "Now you're just torturing me on purpose." Izzy didn't really mind. Anything that put a smile that big on her grandmother's face was fine by her, even if the suspense was driving her mad. When her phone pinged, she grabbed it as though her life depended upon it, and not just because it was a welcome distraction from trying to work out what her grandparents were up to. Tony and Bobby were 2 of the other midwives of the unit, and their first baby was due any day, so every message that came through had Izzy on high alert. But she was already wishing she hadn't bothered looking at her phone. The notification was to tell her that someone had tagged her in a Facebook post, and that someone was her mother, Kirsten. The post was referencing International Hug Your Child Day, and it made the skin on Izzy's scalp prickle. Wish I could hug you, my darling Izzy. It breaks my heart that you're on the other side of the world, but you're my everything, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Izzy's fingers itched to fire off a reply, but it would have turned into a diatribe of epic proportions, not to mention being pointless. Kirsten would never admit she was in the wrong. Her mother loved posting these sorts of messages and memes about the preciousness of mother-daughter relationships, when her every action screamed that she actually thought nothing of the sort. For years, Izzy had made excuses for her, and she'd even told other people that Kirsten wasn't a bad person, but these last few months Izzy had seen a different side to her. All the excuses she'd made about not being able to come and visit Nonna had hit Izzy in a way she'd never felt before. Kirsten had never been interested in Izzy, not really. She'd had her very young, and it was understandable that she couldn't cope, and had left her own parents to raise her daughter as a result. In fact, as far as Izzy was concerned, it was the best thing Kirsten could have done for her. But what was less understandable was her dumping Izzy all over again, just before she turned 16 after they'd had a brief period of reconciliation. Kirsten had chosen to head off to Australia with the new boyfriend she barely knew, telling Izzy she was old enough to make her own way in the world. Since then, she'd only ever got in touch when she wanted something, or when she wanted to paint a picture of herself on social media as some sort of Earth mother who was devastated to be so far away from her only child. No doubt she revelled in all the "hugs, hon, it must be so hard" messages that her posts attracted, but it just made Izzy want to block her mother altogether. The only reason she didn't was because Kirsten might drag Nonna and Pops into it, and Izzy didn't want to cause them any stress. "5 more minutes and we'll be there." Her grandfather's voice interrupted her thoughts, and she shut down the app. Her mother had kept her out of sight and out of mind for most of her life, so she was just returning the favour. "When we get there, I don't want you to think there's any pressure on you. If you don't want to go through with the surprise, that's fine." Nonna suddenly sounded nervous, and Izzy's mind was working overtime. "You haven't booked us a parachute jump, have you?" She'd heard about people adding crazy things to their bucket lists, but surely someone with her grandmother's health issues wouldn't be allowed to make a jump like that, even if she wanted to. "You're safe on that front, sweetheart. It's nothing as dramatic as that." Nonna laughed as her grandfather pulled into a space on the road that led down to the harbour. Maybe her grandparents had booked a trip on one of the little pleasure boats that took tourists up and down the coast between Port Agnes, Port Cara and Port Tremellian. "Come on then, my love. Let's show Iz your big idea." Pops got out of the car first, linking one arm through Nonna's and the other through Izzy's as they followed suit. They were definitely heading to the harbour. "This is it." The wobble in her grandmother's voice was back as they stopped next to a boat moored on the opposite side where the fishing boats and pleasure crafts travelled in and out. The boats on this side clearly weren't working vessels, and the one they were standing next to was a houseboat, complete with window boxes and rows of bunting fluttering in the breeze. "Have you bought a boat?" Izzy turned towards her grandmother, widening her eyes. It had always been her grandmother's dream to live by the sea, but this was taking it to the next level. "Not bought it, but we've rented it for the next 3 months. Or at least we've got the option to." Nonna reached out and squeezed Izzy's hand. "You know I always wished I'd moved to Port Agnes, and this gives us a chance to spend the whole summer here. It also means we'll be more likely to hear about any new places coming on the market for you. I want to see you settled in your own place before—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Izzy bit her lip, holding back the words that were threatening to come tumbling out. She wanted to ask if they were sure this was a good idea, whether it was going to be safe or even practical for her grandparents, especially Nonna. But if it was what her grandmother wanted, then she was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. "So what do you think, baby Belle? Do you think you can survive 3 months on a houseboat with us, starting tonight?" Pops was scanning her face, and Izzy nodded. She wanted to spend every spare minute possible with them, and if cutting out the commute between Port Agnes and Red Ruth gave her more precious time to do that, then she was going to grab the opportunity with both hands. "I think it's going to be brilliant." Are you sure we won't be cramping your style?" Nonna raised her eyebrows, and this time Izzy shook her head. She'd already given notice on her flat in Redruth, having decided to move back in with her grandparents until she managed to find somewhere permanent in Port Agnes. So the timing was perfect. "I haven't got any style to cramp." It was true, and the last thing on her mind was dating. All she wanted was to do the job she adored and to come home to two people she loved even more. And who could ask for a greater adventure than spending the summer living on a houseboat? She just wished it could last forever. Chapter 2. The first night on the houseboat, Izzy slept like a log. Maybe it had been spending the evening on the decked balcony at the back of the boat, chatting with her grandparents and watching the sun seem to slip into the sea as it set. Or maybe it was the peace and quiet once the fishing boats and pleasure cruisers had stopped for the day. Either way, it already felt like home. Waking up to a view of the harbour had got the day off to a great start too, and Izzy was ready for a busy day in clinic. Her first patient was one she hadn't met before, a woman called Nicole Stroud, who was in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy and who was coming in for a routine 31-week checkup. "Morning!" Nicole almost sung the word as she came into the room, looking like a poster girl for the theory that the 3rd trimester was when pregnant women started to glow. Izzy had been a midwife for long enough to know there were plenty of women that this didn't ring true for and who would be willing to slap someone in the face just for suggesting it. "Hi, Nicole. Come on in. I'm Izzy. How's it all going?" "Nice to meet you, Izzy, and it finally seems to be going really well. The sickness has completely stopped at last, thank goodness." Nicole grinned. "Not that I've minded any of the pregnancy symptoms, even the grimmest ones. I'm just so glad to be finally pregnant." "Were you trying for long?" Nicole's record showed she'd had fertility treatment, and sometimes women who'd been through a real challenge to have their babies needed a bit more support. If she was willing to talk about her experience, it might help Izzy to give her the best possible care. "This was our 4th round of IVF, and we both said it was going to be our last, whatever happened." Nicole was still smiling. "I'm just so grateful it worked, and all the wishing and praying paid off." "That must have been tough, but things seem to be going great. All of the screening tests you had at 28 weeks were clear, including the antibody tests." "That's brilliant news, and Gracie seems to be performing somersaults all day and half the night. We're having a private 4D scan on Saturday afternoon, and I can't wait to see her little face." Definitely a moment to treasure. Izzy loved these types of appointments, where everything with the pregnancy was going to plan and the baby expected was already so desperately loved. If there was such a thing as karma, then maybe the pure joy that Nicole was experiencing now was intended to make up for everything she'd been through with the infertility, and Izzy was a sucker for a happy ending. "I'm treasuring every little bit of this pregnancy, especially as this is probably the only time we're going to get to this stage. They're going to make a recording of Gracie's heartbeat during the scan and then put it inside a teddy bear, so I'll always be able to remember what she sounded like when she was curled up in here." Nicole patted her bump. "That's a lovely idea, and it's great to hear that you're feeling so well too. We'll get your blood pressure and urine checks done, just to make sure, and then we can have a listen to her heartbeat and check how much she's grown." The start to Izzy's day had been perfect so far, but she was going to have to shake off the feeling that she just wanted to freeze time. No matter how much she might want it to, this summer, when everything seemed so perfect, couldn't last forever. But she was nowhere near ready to face what autumn might bring just yet. The sound of laughter drifted along the corridor long before Izzy reached the staff room. Anna, the head of the unit, was on maternity leave after the birth of her twins, and Tony had recently given up work to await the arrival of her baby. From the roster, Izzy knew that Jess and Georgia, the newest member of the team, were out on home visits, and that the agency midwives were covering on-call for home deliveries. Ella, who was the deputy head of the unit and who was covering Anna's post, had originally appointed another midwife to cover Tony's leave, but she'd changed her mind at the last minute, which meant they were reliant on agency staff until they could sort it out. Ella and Bobby were covering the birthing suite at the unit. Gwen was running the other clinic, and the 2 full-time maternity care assistants, Emily and Frankie, were also on duty. So it was no wonder it sounded as if there was a party going on in the staff room. Oh, good. Izzy's here. She can have the deciding vote on whether Frankie should go out with the guy who's messaged her or not. Bobby raised his palms upwards, looking as though he'd reached the end of his patience. I'm trying to advocate for her to give the poor guy a shot, but according to Emily, he's a total loser. He's 58 and he still lives with his mum, not to mention the fact that he's got a monobrow that makes him look like a serial killer. Harsh, Izzy laughed, but fair. Emily wasn't going to be persuaded otherwise. There's more to it than the way he looks, surely. Ella, always the voice of reason, was clearly on Bobby's side. Are you telling me that if Dan had looked like Mr. Bean, you'd have still wanted to marry him? It's got to have helped that he looks like a movie star. Gwen pretended to swoon and then wrinkled her nose. The only movie star Frankie's suitor looks like is Danny DeVito, not to mention the fact that he's 2 years off 60 and still lives with his mum. He's probably a lovely man. Izzy looked at the photo on Frankie's phone. And he's got a really kind face. That's what I said, Frankie sighed. What puts me off a lot more is that he's seen every episode of Star Trek ever made at least 3 times, and all the Star Wars movies more times than he can count. He asked if I'd ever thought of dressing like Princess Leia, because apparently I've got the hair for it. Run, Emily shouted the instruction. As fast as you can. Beggars can't be choosers, and he's the first guy who's shown any interest and not immediately suggested we start exchanging extra pictures. Frankie shook her head. I might be naive, and I haven't been in the dating game for years, but even I know what that means. Maybe you should just practice on him. Gwen tapped the side of her nose. You know, get back into the swing of things in the old pass the parsnip department. Pass the parsnip? You should have been a romance writer, Gwen. Ella was clearly trying and failing not to laugh. But one thing you definitely aren't, Frankie, is a beggar, and you should stay as choosy as you want to. I couldn't agree more. Bobby nodded. It's going to take someone special to be good enough for our Frankie. If she waits around for Mr. Right, he'll have to clear the cobwebs first. Gwen never failed to cut to the chase, or to push the boundaries when it came to discussing someone else's personal life. Sometimes Mr. Right now is good enough for the short term. Oh God, I hadn't even thought about all of that. I can't imagine ever subjecting some poor sod to seeing me naked. Maybe I should go for the guy who wants to see me fully dressed, even if it is as Princess Leia. Frankie sounded like she was going off the idea altogether, and Izzy didn't blame her. You could always come to the speed dating night at the Jolly Sailor with me and Izzy. Emily made the offer, but Izzy was already shaking her head. All I said was I'd think about it. She'd only said it in the first place to stop Emily badgering her to say yes. And if that doesn't work out, Emily didn't even acknowledge her comment, then I'll be joining the choir at St. Jude's. I never had you down as the religious type, Em. Bobby grinned again. Oh, I'm not. But did you read in the Three Ports News who's going to be covering for Reverend Sampson when he gets his double knee replacement done? No, but I'm glad he's finally agreed to get the work done. Izzy had seen firsthand how badly he needed the operation. With a lot of help from her grandmother, she'd ended up delivering Reverend Sampson's first grandchild, when his daughter, Abigail, had suddenly gone into labour in the vestry after a charity sing-a-thong at the church. Abigail had confessed to Izzy that she was worried her father would never step away from his responsibilities for long enough to get the operation, and that it might impact his relationship with his new granddaughter as a result. So it was good to hear that Reverend Sampson had taken his daughter's advice at last. It's the Fit Vic! You must have seen him on Instagram. Emily looked stunned that no one seemed to know what she was talking about. He actually calls himself the Fit Vic. Sounds like a complete knob to me. Bobby pulled a face that said it all. No! Emily scrolled through her phone. Other people started calling him that. There's an account set up called @TheFitVicAppreciation, and other people hashtag him with #TheFitVic if they're at one of his sermons. They started with him, but there are 3 vicars the group follow now. One's in Essex and the other one is up north somewhere. But the guy who's coming to St. Jude's is Fit Vic #1. It's a whole thing. It's been in the papers too, and I even saw an interview about it on This Morning when I was off work a couple of months back. Here, look. Now there's someone who could put the rev into getting revved up. Gwen grabbed the phone, but not before Izzy saw the picture. She could admit the new reverend was nice-looking, with dark reddish-brown hair and hazel eyes, but the chances were he knew it. She was with Bobby on this one. Anyone who bought into the description of themselves as fit definitely wouldn't be her cup of tea. "Does this mean you'll be joining the choir too, Gwen?" Izzy could already picture the scene. The new vicar wouldn't know what had hit him. "Quite possibly, but I think I'll be going to a lot of services at St. Jude's myself from now on. Barry lies in so late on a Sunday morning he won't even know I'm gone, but he might get a nice surprise when I get back." "I should be doing something to stop the objectification of my fellow man." Bobby laughed. "But Poppy Chapman's in labour and she's on the way in with her husband, so I'll just make my excuses and check that everything's ready to go. Let me know if you need a hand." Izzy hadn't had as much chance as she'd wanted to get to know the other midwives outside of work, but she liked them all. Usually Gwen's antics had her laughing along with the rest of them, and she'd bonded with Emily when they'd started at the unit in the same month too. But the things that occupied Emily's time, and Gwen's insistence that finding love should be Frankie's #1 priority, just served to remind Izzy how different her life was from everyone else's right now. The only pictures she wanted on her phone were ones of her grandmother getting every bit of fun out of the months ahead as possible. Nothing else was even on her radar. Chapter 3. Noah pulled into the passing place on the road from Port Cara, where the view of Port Agnes below was at its most open. This was the first time he'd be overseeing a parish outside of London. It might never have been in any doubt that he'd follow in his father's footsteps and become a vicar, but he'd never envisaged being the sort who'd open country fetes or oversee a conveyor belt of summer weddings in a pretty parish church that the bride and groom had selected mainly for how good it would look in the wedding photographs. But when the bishop had told him he was being sent to cover Reverend Sampson's absence in Port Agnes, there hadn't been any room for debate. And when the bishop who'd engineered the move was also your godfather, it didn't help. Jeremy had thought this was the best thing for Noah, as had his father apparently, and so that was that. It would only be for 4 months, so 6 at the worst, if Reverend Sampson's recovery was slower than he hoped. Then Noah would be free to go back to where he could really make a difference. There was no denying the beauty of Port Agnes, though. The sun was dancing on the water, and the sea was as smooth as a mill pond, beneath an azure sky that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was perfect, and if he'd been 30 years older, it might even have been the sort of place where he'd want to drift slowly towards retirement. His father was based in a similar sort of parish in Devon, where nothing much ever happened, and the local vicar was still held in high regard. Noah liked a challenge, though. He somehow felt more alive when he was being told to F off by someone he was trying to help get off the streets than he did at any other time. It was those sorts of interactions which could make the doubts that sometimes crept into his mind about treading the expected path disappear, and he was already longing to get back to it. "Come on then, Pabs, let's go down and get this thing started." Noah looked at the little sausage dog curled up on the front seat, who opened his eyes briefly before going straight back to sleep. Noah might not be thrilled about their temporary move to the seaside, but he had a feeling that Pablo was going to love it. The dog had become his shadow ever since they'd first clapped eyes on one another, and Noah could just picture him, his tiny little legs carrying him with surprising speed across the sandy bay in Port Agnes. Maybe he should treat this like an extended sabbatical and work out what he really wanted to do next. Port Agnes might even be good for them both. 10 minutes later, Pablo trotted along behind Noah into the vicarage that would be their home for the next few months. There was still plenty of evidence of its previous incumbent, a reminder that Reverend Sampson had every intention of coming back to take over his parish as soon as he could. Noah would be more than happy to leave most of the rooms undisturbed until then. As long as there was a bathroom, bedroom, kitchen, and a couple of comfortable armchairs for him and Pablo, Noah didn't need anything else. After he'd finished unloading their stuff from the car, the next stop was to have a look at the church and the grounds surrounding it. It didn't get fully dark in Cornwall until well past 9 at this time of year, and he was keen to see whether the church was everything he was expecting. Pablo was determined not to be left behind. His narrow body made him very adept at squeezing through the smallest gaps and following Noah, even when his so-called master didn't want him to. They both knew who was really boss, but this time Noah didn't even try to stop the little dog from coming with him. The pathway down to the church was dotted with dried flower confetti, which must have been from the last wedding St. Jude's had hosted. Reverend Sampson had left the keys and a long list of instructions, which James, the verger, had passed on when he'd been waiting to greet Noah's arrival. Noah had no intention of going against any of his predecessors' guidelines, but he was hoping there'd be a chance to add in a few more things to the agenda, even temporarily, to stop him going completely stir-crazy down in Cornwall. He'd heard about the sing-a-thon that the church had run the previous Christmas to raise money for the school in Tanzania where Reverend Sampson's daughter had worked in the past. Maybe there'd be the chance to carry on that initiative and to introduce some more outreach work like food banks and a debt advice service. Just because Port Agnes and the surrounding area looked picture-perfect, it didn't mean there weren't any problems. Pablo clearly felt comfortable already and had trotted off down the path ahead of Noah. Then suddenly he stopped, about 10 feet back from the porch at the front of the church, his tail going ramrod straight as he started to bark. "What's up, boy? Is there something there?" It was probably a squirrel or something. Back in London, he'd discovered people sleeping rough in church porches quite a few times, and then there was the day when... He couldn't think about that. It wasn't going to happen again, especially not here. It was much more likely to be some local wildlife making itself at home down here. "Sorry if I set him off." A woman suddenly appeared beneath the arch at the entrance to the porch. By Noah's reckoning, he'd have put her in her early 70s, and she clearly didn't look like she was in the habit of sleeping rough. Despite all his bravado that there'd never be a repeat of what had happened in London, he still breathed a sigh of relief. "No problem at all. Pabs likes nothing better than barking at whatever crosses his path. Anything from a feather to his own shadow can do it. I'm sorry if we made you jump. I'm Noah, the new locum vicar covering for Reverend Sampson, and this is Pablo." Noah held out his hand as he drew level with the woman. "It's lovely to meet you both. I'm Eileen. I was hoping to go inside the church, but I didn't realise it would be locked up." "Ah, yes, the verger said he'd locked up after Reverend Sampson left, but I'll let you in now if you like." "That would be great, thank you." Eileen smiled, her shoulders visibly relaxing at the prospect. "I suppose it's a bit of a security risk leaving it open?" "Most churches are locked overnight, and some of them only open for set services, but I'd like to keep St. Jude's open as much as possible. There's actually a school of thought that open access keeps the churches safer, and more than that, it's important for the community to be able to visit their church whenever they want to." "That's a nice idea, and I've certainly felt the draw to visit church a lot more lately." "Anything you want to talk about? I'm told I'm a half-decent listener, although Pablo's a lot better if you'd rather just have him for company." The little dachshund had earned himself a reputation as an unofficial therapy dog. When people put him on their laps, he'd turn to lie full length at their chests instead, nuzzling into their necks, as if he was actually trying to hug them back. There was no doubting that his actions had comforted more people than Noah's words ever had, and if Eileen could benefit from some time with Pablo, the little dog would be more than willing to oblige. "I'm dying." Eileen had uttered just 2 words, but the impact was huge. It didn't matter how many times Noah was faced with a situation like this. It was impossible to find the right response, but he had to say something. "I'm sorry." Sometimes keeping it simple was the best he could do, and he really was sorry about the pain Eileen was clearly going through. It was etched on her face. "It's not so much about me. I've come to terms with it in many ways, and I've had a good life with a very good man. It's leaving him and our beautiful granddaughter behind that's the hardest part of accepting I have to go. I'm the only mother Izzy's really known, and I'd have loved to have stayed around long enough to be there when she starts her own family. When I think about not being there for her, it's the only time I really panic. But just being inside the church somehow helps. I think it's the sense that thousands of others have sat in those pews before me over the years, each with their own troubles and burdens, that somehow lessens what I'm going through. Don't feel you need to try and minimize things. What you're facing is incredibly hard, and you're already thinking about everyone but yourself. Do you ever wonder if there's actually a God? Eileen's voice echoed in the emptiness of the church as they stepped inside, and Noah swallowed hard. I think almost everyone questions that from time to time, or at least faces an event that makes them question their beliefs. I also think it's a good thing. Noah still found it hard not to picture his father's face when he'd first questioned his own faith. Disappointing his father seemed to have been his default position growing up, but that moment had undoubtedly been the worst. I thought you'd tell me that God works in mysterious ways or something. Eileen smiled, hooking her arm through his as if they'd known each other for years. Yet somehow it didn't feel awkward at all. But I much prefer that sort of honesty. Now tell me, what makes a young man like you want to run a parish somewhere like Port Agnes? I just go where I'm told, but I'm already glad they sent me here. How about I leave you to have a bit of thinking time alone like you planned, and I'll put the kettle on over at the vicarage. The verger even left me some walnut cake. How can I say no to that? Eileen smiled again, and Pablo trotted after her. She headed towards the pews. He might be Noah's shadow 90% of the time, but the little dachshund instinctively knew when someone needed him more. Some things couldn't be explained rationally, and the joy that dogs brought into the world was one of them. Not even freshly baked walnut cake could compete with that. When the call finally came through that all the midwives had been waiting for, it took Izzy by surprise. Tony's in labour, and I wondered if you were free to come in and help out. Ella sounded breathless. She wants to have the baby at the unit, and Gwen and Jess are already on a home delivery. Anna wanted to come in, but Bray's got some sort of virus, and she can't leave him on his own with the twins. I can be there in 10 minutes. It was another one of the benefits of living in Port Agnes, and she was already putting on her shoes before she ended the call. Bobby was probably the other midwife she got closest to since starting at the unit. She'd spent a lot of time shadowing him when she joined the team, and Izzy was really excited she was going to get to be there to see his child come into the world. There was always a rush of adrenaline too, anticipating a delivery. But she couldn't have asked for a better midwife than Ella to work alongside. Given that the baby's parents were both midwives as well, there certainly wouldn't be any shortage of expertise in the room. True to her word, Izzy was at the maternity unit on the edge of Port Agnes less than 10 minutes later. Frankie was there too, and Tony had apparently already been in labour for several hours before deciding to come in. It didn't surprise Izzy that Tony was proving to be pretty stoic. She was definitely the no-nonsense sort, and Bobby looked far more panicked than his wife. They'd only been married a couple of weeks before, in late June, and the honeymoon was on hold until after the baby arrived. The two of them had been through a tough time over the last few years, but they had so much to look forward to now. Can you stop breathing so loudly? Tony pulled a face as Bobby leant over to kiss her on the forehead. It's all I can do not to hyperventilate, but I'll do my best, sweetheart. Bobby took his wife's comments with good humour, and she was almost certainly in more pain than she was letting on. If you don't, I'm sending you down the end with all the action, and I don't care what horrors you have to see. It's good to see it's business as usual with you two. Frankie laughed. Maybe a cup of tea would help. At least it would give Bobby something else to think about. He can have the tea. I'll stick to the Antonox. Izzy, Ella, can I get either of you a drink? Frankie asked. Not for me, thanks. Ella shook her head. I'm fine too, thanks, Frankie. Izzy's grandparents constantly seemed to have a pot of tea on the go, and just lately she felt as if she was awash with the stuff. Never mind the tea. I'm having another contraction. Tony clamped the mask over her face and took in another huge breath of gas and air. They're coming every 2 minutes now. I think we'd better have another look and see where we're at. Ella waited for the contraction to ease. Is it okay for me to examine you again? Go for it. Tony lay back against the pillows, not raising any objections as Bobby kissed her again. We're at 8 to 9 centimetres already. Do you want to try moving position? Ella kept her tone light. They all knew Tony well enough to realise that she'd only do what she thought was right. I would, but I can barely sit up with the SPD now, let alone stand. Tony had been diagnosed with symphysis pubis dysfunction caused by the pregnancy hormones loosening the ligaments in her pelvis and resulting in pain and discomfort. Izzy and the rest of the midwives had witnessed what it had put her through. "You could go on all fours, or maybe we could support you to stand." Izzy was aware that Tony would know all the options as well as anyone, but in the midst of labour, and after hours of inhaling Entonox, some women had even been known to forget their partner's name. "I'm not keen on the all-fours position." Tony managed to smile. "It's a good job Gwen's not here to jump on that one, but I'll try to haul myself onto one side. It might not speed things up, but it should at least ease some of the pressure. I'll give you a hand, T." Bobby was the only one who called Tony that, and they exchanged a look that made Izzy smile. There might be 3 other people present at their baby's delivery, but this was a moment just for the 2 of them. "I've got your tea here, Bobby." Frankie came back into the delivery room just as Tony's latest contraction eased off. "Stuff the tea. I need you to keep my mind off all of this by giving us an update on the latest with your love life." There was no arguing with Tony, especially not when she was in labour. "Sadly, there's not much to tell," Frankie shrugged. "Did you reply to the guy who looked like Danny DeVito?" Izzy had felt sorry for the poor man after Gwen's harsh critique, and she couldn't help hoping he'd turn out to surprise them all. "I'm still talking to him, but the pictures of Princess Leia he keeps sending over are hard to get past." Frankie screwed up her face. "I think I might just stop trying to make it happen. If I meet someone, that's great. If not, I'll just have to live vicariously through you and Emily. Dating is definitely easier without all the baggage of having been through 30 years of marriage. You'll be dining on scraps if you're living vicariously through me, but I reckon Emily will have enough stories to keep us going." Izzy laughed. Emily still hadn't given up trying to persuade Izzy to join her at speed dating, but she could nag all she liked. It wasn't going to happen. "Come on, some of you must have some gossip." Tony twisted the last word as another contraction took hold and she gripped Bobby's hand from across the bed. The contractions were barely a minute apart now. "I don't think it's going to be long." Ella put a hand on Tony's leg. "Let me know if you feel like you're ready to start pushing." "Ooh, you'll know," Tony spoke through gritted teeth. "But if one of you doesn't come up with something to distract me from waiting for the next contraction, you're all in trouble." "I told you about Mum and Dad's latest plans for the wedding, didn't I?" Ella rolled her eyes. "I don't think so." Tony's face was still contorted, and she didn't seem to be getting any significant relief between pains now. "Dad was planning to talk to Reverend Sampson about Dan exchanging vows with him and Mum before he does it with me." Ella pulled a face that couldn't even come close to expressing how horrified she must have been at the prospect. Having to exchange vows with the in-laws. Now that would cut down wedding bookings pretty drastically. Izzy couldn't help laughing. Either way, Dan was clearly marrying into the entire Mahenic family. Well, vows is probably too strong a word, but they, mostly Dad if we're honest, wanted Dan to make them some promises about always taking care of me. Ella shook her head. "I did try to tell them that those things were more or less written into the wedding vows anyway, but Dad was still determined to try and get Reverend Sampson on board. Thank goodness the new guy has taken over. He might be gone before we get married in February, but it'll be too late to add anything new into the ceremony by then. At least that's what I've told Dad." "Ah!" "Are you right, sweetheart?" Bobby asked the question as a guttural groan from Tony broke through the laughter. "If this baby isn't crowning, someone must have set my pubes on fire because everything down there's burning." Tony dropped her chin to her chest and grimaced again as Izzy tried to fight the laughter bubbling inside her. There was nothing funny about their friend being in this much pain, but Izzy could see that Frankie and Ella were struggling not to laugh either. "You're amazing, T, and our baby's going to be here soon. I love you so much." Bobby was gripping his wife's hand, and even if he hadn't declared his love for her, it would have been written all over his face. "You're right, the baby's crowning, so there's no need to call the fire brigade." Ella grinned. "If you're happy to stay lying on your side, Izzy could hold up your leg if you're comfortable like that, to make the baby's exit a bit easier." "Uh-huh," was all Tony could manage. "Let me know if this gets uncomfortable at any point." Izzy took hold of Tony's leg, standing on the opposite side of the bed to Bobby. "I'll get everything ready for when this very special little person arrives." Frankie sniffed, obviously fighting back the tears. It was the first time Izzy had been at the delivery of someone she was friends with, and there was a pretty big lump in her throat too. When she'd first started her midwifery training, she'd struggled to hold back the tears at every delivery she'd attended. The emotion was always so heightened. But it had been a long time since she'd been as emotional as she was right now. "Okay, Tony, this is it. The next push is going to do it." Ella's tone was as calm and reassuring as ever. "T, I think the baby's got my hair," Bobby grinned. He was still clutching her hand, but he was looking down the bed towards where Ella was ready to guide his and Tony's baby into the world. "I'm just hoping the rest is all like you." "You're about to find out, because baby's head is all the way out now." As Ella spoke, Izzy could see the baby's face from her side of the bed because of the position Tony was in. The battle to hold in the tears was well and truly lost. "Thank God for that, because I don't think I can do much more of this." Tony sounded as exhausted as she looked. "You've already done the hard bit, lovely. Just let your body do what it needs to, and I promise it will." Frankie was the only one in the room who could speak from personal experience, and Tony nodded in response, dropping her chin to her chest again as another urge to push took hold. "That's it, baby's out. You've done so brilliantly." As Ella took the baby, who had a very healthy-sounding pair of lungs, Izzy released Tony's leg and she turned onto her back. "Let's get baby up onto your chest and you can see what you've got." "Oh, Bobby, look." Tony peeled back the blanket. "We've got a little girl, and I already know she's going to be Daddy's girl." She leant her head against Bobby's as they gazed down at their daughter, who'd stopped crying, unlike everyone else in the room, as soon as she was placed on her mother's chest. "Oh, T, she's beautiful." Bobby wasn't even trying to hold back the emotion that was choking his voice. "This is everything I've ever wanted, and I've got the two best girls in the world." "She really is beautiful." Izzy looked at the little girl, who had her father's dark curly hair, olive skin, and was already very alert-looking, as if she couldn't wait to take in everything the world had to offer. "Congratulations, you guys." "She's totally gorgeous." Frankie sniffed again. "Have you got a name?" "Yes, she's going to be Yoni, after Bobby's great-grandmother." Tony stroked her new daughter's hair. "We lost her a couple of years back, but every time I went to Jamaica with Mum to visit her family, being with G was always the best thing about it." Bobby was still staring down at his daughter. "She was just the best, so we couldn't think of a better name. Her middle name is really special too, isn't it, T? We've chosen Aaron as a tribute to Aaron. It just felt like the right thing to do. Thank you all so much for getting her here safely. We really never thought we'd have all of this." Tony exchanged another look with Bobby, who dropped the tenderest of kisses onto her forehead. Izzy and the others knew all about Aaron, Tony's former fiancé, who died of a sudden brain hemorrhage 6 years ago. For a long time, Tony had blamed herself for not being able to stop the tragedy, and then for moving on by finding love with Bobby. But now they were finally enjoying the life together they both so deserved. What they'd been through made baby Yoni's arrival all the more magical. "Okay, that's it. I need to get more tissues." Ella had spoken for them all, but Izzy had already had to resort to wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. There was nothing as special as moments like this, and she could hardly wait to tell Nonna the news. It was the only thing that could make her day even better than it had been already. Chapter 4. By the time Izzy got back to the houseboat, she was brimming over with excitement at the prospect of sharing the news of Yoni's arrival with her grandmother. Tony had let them all take photos on their phones, and Bobby had already put pictures and updates on his social media accounts, so there wasn't anything she'd be telling Nonna that wasn't already out there. But when she got back to the boat, her grandfather was sitting alone on the balcony at the back, reading his newspaper with a half-pint of cider on the go. "Baby Belle, come on, grab a seat and you can keep me company and tell me about your day." He looked up and smiled when he saw her, patting the empty chair beside him. "Hey, Pops." Izzy kissed his cheek, the comfortingly familiar smell of his favourite aftershave still clinging to his skin, and then took the seat next to him. "Where's Nonna gone?" "Off for another one of her walks up to St. Jude's. If I didn't know better, I'd say she has a thing for that young vicar." Pops waggled his eyebrows. "Sounds like most people have. There's even something about him in the paper." "He's in there on a regular basis, according to Emily, although at least his celebrity status is not driven by him from the sound of things." If Nonna needed to offload how she was feeling onto a stranger, then the local vicar seemed as good a choice as any, even if the thought made Izzy sad. Though she'd have hated the thought even more if this new guy, Reverend Andrews, had been taking selfies for Instagram on his phone the whole time, instead of actually doing what he could to help her grandmother. "He's certainly a good-looking boy. He must remind your grandmother of how I looked back in the day." Pop squeezed her hand. "But I'm not going to complain if it gets me some time on my own with my other favourite girl. So how's it going at work?" "Tony and Bobby had their baby today." Izzy passed her phone to Pops so he could see a photograph. "She's called Yoni, after Bobby's great-grandmother." "Perhaps one of your children will want to call their baby George after me." Pops raised his eyebrows. "Although first you'll have to have a baby, of course, and I'd like to think I might still be around to see that. You've just got to get out there and meet someone." "Don't you start. I've already got Emily on my case about that, but I'm happy as I am. I've got everything I need with you and Nonna." "We won't be here forever, though, Iz." Pop sighed. "And sometimes it worries me that things with your mother have stopped you getting close to anyone. You're nothing like her, you know, and your relationships won't end up like hers either. Anyone will be lucky to have you in their life." "You've got to say that. You're my granddad." Izzy leant her head towards his and he squeezed her hand again. "It's nothing to do with that. Anyone can see what an amazing girl you are. If I even slightly fit that description, it's because of you and Nonna." Izzy swallowed. Every time she thought about the fact that her grandmother would, in all likelihood, be gone by the end of the year, she forced herself to think about something else. Anything would do. "So how's your day been? Did you speak to Dave about going back over to Redruth for the Skittles tournament next weekend?" "Yes. He said they need me against the team from the Horse and Hounds. But I don't like the idea of leaving your grandmother at home, and for some reason she doesn't fancy coming to watch a load of old blokes playing skittles." "I'm off for most of the weekend, so I can make plans with Nonna. That's if she can tear herself away from Reverend Andrews." "You're an angel, baby Belle." Her grandfather's shoulders relaxed. It was obvious how much he loved spending time with Nonna, but it must have been a strain on him too, watching for every little sign that the new medication had stopped working. "I think after the day you've had, you deserve to have dinner cooked for you." "You're going to cook?" There were a million brilliant things about her grandfather, but his cooking wasn't one of them. The attempts he'd made after her grandmother was diagnosed were as hilarious as they were horrifying. The mashed potato with big black lumps that could have choked an unsuspecting diner, and unidentifiable meat that could have been used to resole shoes. "No, it's supposed to be a reward, not a punishment. I'll go and get us all some dinner from Penrose Place. You know how much your grandmother likes the food there." It was the fish and chip shop owned by Anna's husband, Bray, and it had won armfuls of awards. That sounds like heaven. Izzy's stomach rumbled at the thought. She hadn't realised how hungry she was, and she hadn't eaten all day. "Shall I give Nonna a call and let her know?" "She usually has her phone off when she's up at the church, so we might have to put hers in the oven." "I could just walk up and get her. It will give me a chance to fill her in on Tony and Bobby's baby on the way home." "Good idea. You know I can't cope with any of the details." Pops laughed. He'd been known to leave the room more than once when Izzy and her grandmother had started to talk shop. Nonna had always wanted to be a midwife, but she needed to earn money straight from school, so it hadn't been an option. It meant she loved hearing as much as Izzy could tell her, without ever breaking patient confidentiality, and it had the added bonus of making Izzy feel as though she had access to a counsellor whenever she needed it. The midwives could access professional counselling support through work, but they mostly relied on one another. Having Nonna was like an extra layer, though, and there'd been times when she'd really needed it. Days when one of her patients had a third miscarriage, or when one of her ladies had come in to discuss the results of a genetic test, which meant her baby wouldn't make it much past delivery. Nonna had been able to make things seem bearable again every time. But sharing happy news, like Yoni's arrival, would be an absolute joy. "I'll have her back here in 40 minutes. "Great, and I'll have the table laid with the fish and chips ready and waiting." Pops did a mock salute, and Izzy got up. The rest of the world might wish for Michelin-starred dinners in top-notch restaurants, but give her a takeaway with her grandparents any time. Nothing else could even compare. Noah had the perfect view of the garden at the vicarage from the upstairs window. There was a wall that separated it from the churchyard, and Eileen was moving methodically down the longest flower bed, cutting the stems she wanted and adding them to a wooden trug. If his mother saw this garden, he'd struggle to drag her away too. Whenever he went home, she always seemed to either be out with her 2 dogs or in the garden, and it didn't matter what time of year it was or what the weather was like. Sometimes his mother and father seemed to exist in 2 parallel worlds, each doing their own thing, side by side, yet never quite seeming to come together. But then maybe that was how a perfect partnership worked, each person knowing their own role and fulfilling it, leaving the other free to pursue their own interests. His father always seemed to have his head buried in a book in his study when he wasn't out and about on parish business. Eileen looked every bit as at home in the vicarage garden as Noah's mother would have done, and she'd already told him that her own garden was really the only bit she missed about not being in Redruth, aside from seeing friends. Spending a summer on a houseboat when you'd been given a terminal diagnosis might have sounded crazy on paper, but he'd seen the light behind Eileen's eyes when she talked about it. She was one of those people who'd decided to squeeze every bit out of however much life she had left, instead of losing herself in the grief at the prognosis. He'd seen both reactions to devastating news and didn't judge anyone who lost the ability to even get out of bed when they'd had that sort of diagnosis. He had no idea how he'd react in the same circumstances after all. But what he did know was that he admired Eileen more than he could express. In the short time he'd known her, he'd come to really like her too. It wasn't just that glimpses of her reminded him of his own mother. She was warm and funny too, and able to laugh at what she was facing up to. Eileen was inspirational, and people on social media would get far more out of meeting her than him. But because of the ridiculous account someone had set up on Instagram, it was him they came to see. It wasn't as if there were big groups of them who actually turned up in person, thank goodness. Just the odd 1 or 2 every few days. But what they might lack in numbers, they made up for in tenacity. One woman in particular had clearly needed help and had built up the illusion that she was in some sort of relationship with Noah, having attended his services, and started following him around in a way that felt dangerously close to stalking, waiting outside his house for hours on end. She'd also uploaded hundreds of photographs of him online, tagging in the @TheFitVic Appreciation Instagram account. He'd asked for it to be taken down after that, or at least for mentions of him to be removed. But it seemed nothing he said held any sway, and because she wasn't the one who'd set up the original account, it was still going strong. For a while, he'd thought about trying to embrace his social media following instead, to see if he could use it to raise the profile of causes close to his heart. But the idea of putting himself out there filled him with dread. Whilst the numbers of people who turned up on his doorstep were thankfully low, the account itself had over 100,000 followers. When the girl who'd first set it up appeared on This Morning to talk about why she'd done it, she'd said she'd wanted to encourage more young people to go to church. He'd recognised her as a regular from his last parish in London, and while there had been a few quotes from his services, she must have almost had to stalk him too in order to get the photos she had. There were lots of pictures from his daily runs, and even changing his route didn't seem to have stopped her capturing his every move. He'd been hoping it would all die down now he was buried in the depths of Cornwall, so finding 2 women waiting for him in the church the day before, saying they'd seen from the Instagram account that he was now down in Port Agnes, had thrown him off course. They hadn't stopped taking photos the whole time he was talking to them. He was more grateful than ever for having met Eileen, and creating at least one genuine connection with someone in the area. Otherwise, he might have started questioning all over again whether coming to Cornwall was a complete waste of time. Reverend Sampson's going to be really relieved to hear that someone is taking care of the garden and making sure it doesn't get overrun. He smiled as he walked across the garden towards where Eileen was standing. I can barely tell the difference between a daffodil and a tulip. Well, you can't be good at everything, young man. She returned his smile. You appear to be. I came to see if you wanted a cup of tea. Now that sounds like a plan.